What if the voice you have been listening for was never outside of you? What if the one you have been calling, praying to, searching for, has never once been separate from your own awareness of being? And the only reason it felt distant is because you were trained to look away from yourself. From the very beginning, you were taught to interpret reality as something happening from the outside. A world of causes, forces, people, events, all shaping your life. And within that framework, you became a responder, a reactor, someone adjusting to what appears instead of recognizing what is being expressed. But something in you has always resisted that explanation. Something quiet, almost unnoticeable, that has whispered, this cannot be the whole truth, because there are moments, subtle, fleeting, where reality feels different, not changed, but revealed, where instead of reacting, you observe, and instead of feeling controlled, you sense something deeper, something prior to everything you see. And in those moments, a question emerges without words. What if this is coming from me? This is where the shift begins. Not with belief, not with effort, but with recognition. Because the idea that everything originates within you is not something you need to adopt, it is something you begin to remember. And memory, in this sense, is not about the past. It is about truth resurfacing. In the text you've just encountered, there is a pattern, one that reveals itself slowly. A voice first appears as external, a dialogue between man and God, a conversation that seems to happen between two separate beings. But then something subtle is introduced. These are not persons, they are states. And that changes everything. Because if these figures are states of consciousness, then the entire story is internal, not historical, not external, not happening somewhere else, but unfolding within you. So when the voice says, I am that I am, it is not introducing a name. It is pointing to a reality, not something you should worship, but something you are already using. Because before you say anything, you say, I am. Before you define yourself as rich or poor, successful or lost, certain or confused, there is always this quiet foundation, I am. And everything you add after that becomes your experience. Not because the world decides it, but because you have assumed it. This is the part most people overlook. They think the power lies in what they want, but the power is in what they identify as themselves. Because I am is not a phrase, it is a position, a state of being, and whatever follows it is accepted as true at the deepest level of your consciousness. So when you say, I am struggling, you're not describing reality. You are selecting it. When you say, I am trying, you are not being honest. You are being consistent with the state you have already occupied. And that state will continue to express itself, not because it is real, but because you remain in it. Now consider something more carefully. If I am is the root, then everything you experience must grow from it, not from circumstances, not from conditions, but from identity. And identity is not fixed, it is assumed. So again, without pressure, but with precision. What are you assuming right now? Not what you want, not what you hope, but what you quietly, naturally, without effort, accept as true about yourself. Because that acceptance, that unspoken agreement, is what reality reflects most faithfully. And this is why the idea of an external God becomes limiting, not because it is wrong, but because it is incomplete. Because as long as you believe the source is outside, you remain separate from it. You remain dependent. You remain waiting. But the moment you realize that what you call God is your own awareness of being, everything changes direction. You stop asking. You start assuming. You stop hoping. You start becoming. And this is not a motivational shift, it is a structural one. It changes how you relate to everything. Because now, instead of asking, why is this happening to me? you begin to ask something far more accurate. What state am I in that is producing this? And the moment you ask that sincerely, you begin to see patterns, not random events, but consistent reflections, not coincidence, but continuity, because reality does not argue with you. It does not question you. It simply expresses what you are being. So if you remain in the state of waiting, reality will continue to give you things to wait for. If you remain in the state of not having, reality will continue to confirm that absence. Not as punishment, but as reflection. Because the world is not happening to you. It is echoing you. And once you begin to see this, not intellectually, but experientially, something shifts in how you move. You become less reactive, less dependent on appearances, less concerned with what is currently visible, because you understand that what is visible is only the result, not the cause. And the cause is always within. So when the text says that what was once heard from without must eventually be heard from within, it is not describing a future event. It is describing a transition of awareness from separation to identity, from worship to realization, from searching to knowing. And that knowing does not arrive loudly. It does not announce itself. It simply becomes undeniable, like something you have always known, but never fully allowed yourself to accept. You are not separate from reality. You are its source. And the moment you stop looking outward for confirmation and begin to observe inwardly what you are being, you step into the only place where change is possible. Not outside, but within. And from there, everything else follows. There's a reason the voice first appears to come from outside. Not because it is truly separate, but because you are not yet aware enough to recognize it as your own. So consciousness in its early stage projects itself outward and then listens to itself as if it were another. This is not an error, it is a necessary illusion. Because before you can consciously be the source, you must first encounter it as something beyond you. Only then can you return and recognize that it was never beyond you at all. This is why the idea of God speaking to man exists in the form it does. It reflects a stage, not a final truth. A stage where awareness is still divided, where the experiencer and the source appear separate. But that separation cannot remain forever, because eventually what is heard externally must be realized internally. And when that happens, the entire structure of belief collapses, not into confusion, but into clarity. Because now, the voice is no longer something you wait for. It is something you are, not as words, not as thoughts, but as the very sense of being. That quiet, constant knowing that exists before anything else is added. Before identity, before roles, before stories, there is simply this I am. And this is where the misunderstanding begins to dissolve. Because most people think of I am as a beginning of a sentence. But it is not a sentence. It is a state. It is the root of all states. And whatever you attach to it, you animate. Not symbolically, not metaphorically, literally. So when you say, I am not there yet, you are not describing a journey. You are defining a position. And from that position, reality must reflect not yet. When you say, I am trying, you are not expressing effort. You are selecting a state where completion is always postponed. And so life continues to mirror that delay. Not because it is testing you, but because it is consistent with you. This is why effort often leads nowhere. Because effort is usually applied from the wrong identity. You are trying to get something while still being the one who does not have it. You are visualizing while still identifying as someone waiting. And in that contradiction, nothing stabilizes. You move, but you do not shift. So the real question is not, what are you doing? It is, who are you being while doing it? Because doing follows being. never the other way around. And if the being is unchanged, the doing becomes repetition. Different actions, same state. Different attempts, same identity. And therefore the same results. Now pause for a moment and observe something very precisely. Not what you say publicly, not what you declare intentionally, but what feels natural to you. Because what feels natural is your state. And your state is what creates. Are you used to things working out or not? Are you used to being chosen or overlooked? Are you used to having or waiting? These are not surface thoughts. These are embedded assumptions. And they operate quietly, consistently, without needing your attention. And that is why they are powerful, because you do not question them. You live from them. And whatever you live from becomes your world. So the shift is not about forcing new thoughts. It is about becoming aware of the ones you already accept. Because once you see them clearly, you realize something important. They are not fixed. They are chosen, not consciously at first, but chosen through repetition, through agreement, through familiarity. And what is chosen can be changed, not by fighting it, not by denying it, but by leaving it, by no longer returning to that state as self. And this is where the idea of assumption becomes real. Not as a technique, but as a movement of identity. You assume a state the moment you feel it as yours, not when you repeat it, not when you say it, but when it feels natural. So if you want to understand how reality changes, do not look at actions. Look at what you have accepted as normal, because normal is not neutral. It is active. It is the baseline from which everything grows. And if your baseline is lack, you will continue to experience lack, even when opportunities appear. If your baseline is uncertainty, you will continue to doubt, even when things begin to align. Because the state filters everything. It does not just create events, it interprets them. This is why two people can experience the same situation and see completely different realities. One sees opportunity, the other sees risk. One sees confirmation, the other sees doubt. And both are correct within their own state. Because reality does not exist independently of you. It exists relative to you, relative to what you are being. So again, gently but clearly. Are you trying to change what you see or what you are? Because one keeps you reacting. The other makes you the cause. And the moment you become the cause, everything else becomes adjustable. Not instantly in appearance, but immediately in direction. Because direction is determined by state. And once the direction changes, the outcome is already implied. You do not need to know how it will happen. You only need to know who you are being. Because that answer is already shaping everything. There's a point where this understanding stops being philosophical and becomes deeply personal. Because once you see that everything begins with I am, you can no longer treat your inner dialogue as harmless. You can no longer assume that thoughts are just passing noise, because they are not. They are selections, quiet, repeated selections of identity. And identity, once accepted, begins to organize reality around itself. So when the text speaks of prayer, it is not describing a request. It is describing appropriation, the taking of something desired and accepting it inwardly as already true. Not hoping it becomes true, not asking for permission, but assuming it is done. And this is where most people hesitate, because assumption feels too simple to be powerful. It does not look like effort. It does not feel like control. It requires no visible action. And yet, it is the only thing that actually changes the structure beneath appearances. Because what you assume, you become. And what you become must be expressed. Not eventually, not randomly, but inevitably. The only variable is stability. Whether you remain in that assumption long enough for it to solidify. Because assumption is not fragile. It does not fail. It is simply replaced when you return to an old state. This is why persistence is not about repeating words. It is about remaining in identity, remaining in the feeling of already being, not forcing it, not intensifying it, but settling into it. The way you settle into something that no longer needs to be questioned, like your own name, you do not repeat it to believe it. You simply are it. And this reveals something important. The goal is not to feel excited. The goal is to feel natural. Because excitement fades, but naturalness stabilizes. And only what stabilizes becomes visible. So again, quietly. If it were already yours, how would you feel? Not in a moment of intensity, but as a baseline, as something ordinary. Because the state you are seeking is not dramatic. It is familiar. It is the feeling of course. And that feeling cannot coexist with longing. It cannot exist alongside waiting. Because waiting implies separation. And separation contradicts being. This is why wanting keeps you stuck. Not because desire is wrong, but because wanting is a state of not having. And if you remain in that state, you continue to experience not having, even while trying to change it. Because again, reality reflects what you are, not what you try to become. So the shift is precise, not from wanting to getting, but from wanting to being, from imagining as an activity to imagining as identity. And this requires something subtle. You must stop using imagination to look at what you want and begin using it to experience from it. Because there's a difference between seeing something and being inside it. One keeps you separate. The other removes the distance. And once the distance is removed, the state changes. And once the state changes, the reflection must follow. This is why the text insists that believing I am is essential. Not as belief in a concept, but as recognition of identity. Because if you do not believe that you are the one who creates, you will continue to look outside for causes. And as long as you look outside, you will remain dependent on what you see. But the moment you accept that I am is the source, something shifts in how you relate to everything. You stop reacting automatically. You begin to observe your own responses. You begin to notice how quickly you return to old assumptions and how those assumptions recreate the same experiences. And that awareness is the beginning of control. Not control over the world, but control over your state. And your state is the only thing that matters. So when something unwanted appears, the question is no longer why did this happen, but what was I being? Not as blame, but as clarity. Because the answer is always there if you are willing to see it without resistance. And once you see it, you are no longer trapped by it. Because now you can choose again. Not by force, not by denial, but by shifting your identity. By returning to the state you prefer and remaining there. Even if appearances do not immediately confirm it. Because confirmation is not the beginning, it is the result. And this is where faith becomes real. Not faith in something outside of you, but faith in your own assumption. The willingness to remain in a state without needing proof. The ability to feel something as true before it becomes visible. Because what is visible is always behind. It is always the echo. And you are the voice. So again, gently but with precision, are you living from what you see or from what you have assumed? Because one makes you a follower of reality. The other reveals that you are its author. And the moment you truly accept that, not intellectually, but as a lived identity, something stabilizes. You stop chasing change. You start embodying it. You stop asking when it will happen. You start knowing that it already is. And from that knowing, everything begins to rearrange. Not because you forced it, but because you became it. There is a subtle trap that appears right after you begin to understand this, and it is not obvious, because it feels like you are doing everything correctly. You begin to assume, you begin to imagine, you begin to feel differently. And yet, a part of you is still watching, still checking, still measuring reality to see if it has changed. And in that quiet checking, you return to the old state without realizing it. Because checking is not neutral. Checking implies doubt. It implies that what you have assumed is not yet real, and so you look outward for confirmation. But the moment you look outward for proof, you are no longer living from the state, you are evaluating it. And evaluation belongs to the old identity, the one that waits, the one that needs evidence, the one that still believes reality is outside of you. So even though you have imagined something new, you have not remained there. You visit it briefly and then returned. And reality does not respond to visits, it responds to residence. This is why many people feel like they are doing the technique, but nothing changes, because they are still dividing themselves. One part assumes, another part observes. One part believes, another part doubts. And in that division, there is no stability. There is movement, but no direction. So the shift becomes even more precise now. It is no longer about imagining something new. It is about no longer returning to the old interpretation of reality. Because the old interpretation is what keeps recreating the same world. Not the events themselves, but the meaning you assign to them. Two people can face the same situation. One sees delay, the other sees alignment. One sees rejection, the other sees redirection. And both experiences feel real, because both are consistent with the state they are in. So again, without urgency, are you reacting to what appears, or are you remaining in what you chose? Because reaction pulls you back. It pulls you into the familiar pattern of interpreting everything through the old identity, and that identity will always confirm itself. Not because it is true, but because it is consistent. This is why you must become aware of something deeper than thought. Not just what you are thinking, but what you are agreeing with. Because agreement is what stabilizes the state. The moment you internally say, this is how it is, you have accepted a position. And from that position, everything begins to organize itself. So if something unwanted appears, and you immediately agree with it emotionally, mentally, internally, you are not observing it. You are reinforcing it. You are selecting it again. And that selection is what allows it to continue. But if instead you see it and do not agree with it, not by denying it, but by not identifying with it, something changes. You are no longer inside that state. You are outside of it, observing it. And from that position, you can choose again. Because you are not your reactions. You are the one who selects them. And this realization gives you something most people never use: space. The space between what appears and what you accept. And in that space, there is freedom. Not freedom to control everything, but freedom to choose your state regardless of what is seen. And that is the only control that matters. Because once the state is chosen and maintained, reality has no independence. It must follow, not immediately in form, but inevitably in direction. And direction is what shapes outcome. Now understand this clearly. You are not trying to convince reality. You are not trying to force change. You are not trying to override circumstances. You are simply no longer identifying with them. And without identification, they lose their authority. Because authority is given, not taken. And most people give authority to what they see. They let appearances define their state. They let circumstances dictate their feeling. And in doing so, they remain inside the very structure they are trying to escape. But the moment you reverse that, the moment you let your state define how you see, instead of letting what you see define your state, everything begins to reorganize quietly, gradually, naturally. And this is where trust becomes real. Not trust in an outcome, but trust in the process of being. The understanding that if you remain in a state long enough, it must express. Not because you hope it will, but because it cannot do otherwise. So again, gently, are you still looking for proof, or are you willing to remain without it? Because remaining without proof is not blindness. It is alignment. It is the recognition that what you have assumed is already real, even if it has not yet appeared. And when that recognition stabilizes, something changes inside you. You stop checking. You stop measuring. You stop asking when, because you no longer need an answer. You already are the answer. And from that point, reality begins to reflect you more clearly. Not because it changed, but because you did. There is a moment very quiet, almost unnoticeable, where imagination stops being something you do and becomes somewhere you are. Most people never cross that threshold, not because it is difficult, but because they never stop trying. They approach imagination as effort, as repetition, as something that must be done correctly. And in doing so, they remain outside of it, observing, adjusting, controlling, never actually entering. Because entering requires something you have not been trained to do. It requires you to stop trying to make it real and instead allow it to be real, not later, not gradually, but now internally. And that shift feels subtle, but it is absolute. Because the moment you allow it to be real within you, you are no longer imagining towards something, you are experiencing from it. And that is the difference that changes everything. Because when you imagine from the outside, you remain the same person, looking at a different possibility. But when you imagine from within, you become a different person entirely. And reality does not respond to possibilities. It responds to identity. So the question is not whether you can see it clearly. The question is whether you can feel it as natural. Because clarity without embodiment changes nothing. You can visualize perfectly and still remain in the state of not having. And if that is the state you return to, that is the reality that continues. This is why the text speaks of faith, not as belief in something external, but as acceptance of something unseen as real. Not convincing yourself, not repeating affirmations, but accepting without resistance. And acceptance is not loud. It does not require effort. It feels like settling, like something clicking into place. So again, quietly, if it were already done, would you still be trying this hard, or would you be resting in the fact that it is done? Because that rest, that absence of effort, is not laziness. It is alignment. It is what happens when there is no contradiction between what you desire and what you believe yourself to be. And when that contradiction disappears, something stabilizes. You stop moving between states. You stop going back and forth. You remain. And remaining is the only thing that matters. Now consider how most people live. They imagine something for a moment, feel a temporary shift, and then return to their day reacting, checking, doubting, interpreting everything through the old identity. And then they wonder why nothing changes. But they have already answered the question. They did not remain. They visited a state, but did not live there. And again, reality does not respond to visits. It responds to residence. So the practice is not to imagine more, it is to return less. To notice when you slip back into the familiar feeling of not having, of waiting, of needing proof, and instead of fighting it, simply step out of it. Not forcefully, not dramatically, but gently. By remembering the state you chose, by re-entering it quietly, as if it were the most natural place in the world. Because eventually, it will be. That is the point. Not to maintain effort forever, but to reach a place where no effort is required, where the new identity feels more real than the old one ever did, where you no longer think I am becoming this, but simply this is who I am. And from that point, something irreversible happens. You stop imagining to get something, and you begin imagining because it is true. And when imagination becomes truth to you, reality has already begun to conform. Not because you forced it, but because you aligned with it. Because you are no longer divided. You are no longer trying to change something while remaining the same. You have changed, and everything else is following. So let me ask you again, more honestly now. Are you visualizing or are you embodying? Because visualizing is temporary. Embodying is identity. And identity is what creates. There is a point where this is no longer about learning, but about leaving. Leaving a version of yourself that has felt normal for so long that you no longer question it. Because once you see clearly that every experience is tied to a state, and every state is sustained by an assumption, something becomes undeniable. You are not stuck, you are consistent. And consistency, when unconscious, feels like fate. It feels like life repeating itself for reasons you cannot control. But once you become aware, that same consistency reveals something else entirely. It reveals that what you have been calling reality has been faithfully reflecting who you have been being. Not once, not occasionally, but continuously. So the question shifts again. It is no longer how do I change my life. It becomes much more direct, much more precise. Am I willing to stop being who I have been? Not improve it, not adjust it, but leave it. Because every state is complete. It comes with its own thoughts, its own reactions, its own expectations. And you cannot carry one into another. You cannot be someone who doubts and someone who knows at the same time. You cannot be waiting and having simultaneously. One must be released for the other to be occupied. And this is where most people hesitate. Not because they do not understand, but because they feel the cost. The cost is not effort. The cost is familiarity. You must let go of what feels natural, even if it produces what you do not want. You must step into something that feels unfamiliar, even if it represents what you desire. And that moment, that brief space where the new state feels not quite you yet, is where most people turn back. They interpret that unfamiliarity as resistance, as failure, as a sign that it is not working. But in reality, it is the opposite. It is the sign that you are no longer where you were. So the work is not to eliminate that feeling. The work is to remain anyway, to stay in the chosen state long enough for it to become natural. Because naturalness is not something you wait for. It is something you allow through repetition of being. Not repetition of words, but repetition of identity. An identity is shaped by what you return to, again and again, quietly, consistently. So let me ask you something, and feel this honestly. Are you remaining or are you returning? Because every time you return to the old state, through doubt, through reaction, through interpretation, you are not slowing progress. You are selecting again. You are reaffirming the same identity that has already produced the same reality. And there is no judgment in that, only clarity. Because the moment you see it, you also see the alternative. You see that you can choose again, not once, but continuously. This is why awareness is everything. Not discipline in the traditional sense, not forcing yourself to think differently, but noticing when you have slipped back into the familiar state and gently stepping out of it, not fighting it, not analyzing it, just leaving it. Because what is not occupied cannot continue. And what is not fed, fades. Now understand this deeply. You are not trying to destroy an old identity. You are simply withdrawing from it. And without your attention, without your agreement, without your emotional reinforcement, it loses its structure. It dissolves, not because you attacked it, but because you stopped being it. And in that space, something else stabilizes. Something quieter, but far more powerful. A new sense of self that does not need to be maintained through effort. A new baseline that begins to feel obvious. And once it feels obvious, it becomes reality. Because reality does not respond to what you occasionally feel. It responds to what you consistently are. So if you move back and forth one moment certain, the next doubtful, one moment aligned, the next reactive, nothing stabilizes. Not because it is not working, but because you are not remaining long enough in one state for it to express clearly. So again, gently. Are you choosing a state or visiting it? Because choosing is continuous, visiting is temporary, and only what is continuous becomes visible. This is why time appears to exist in the process, not because manifestation takes time, but because you are still moving between identities. And that movement creates delay, not in reality, but in your consistency. The moment you stop moving, the moment you remain, the process completes internally. And once it is complete internally, the external has no choice but to follow. Not because you made it happen, but because you became it. So now everything simplifies, not easier, but clearer. You do not need to control circumstances. You do not need to manage outcomes. You do not need to force anything into place. You only need to decide who you are and remain there until it feels so natural that you forget you ever were anything else. There is a realization that comes after you have practiced this for a while. And it is not dramatic, not overwhelming, but quietly undeniable. You begin to notice that nothing in your world is truly independent. Not people, not events, not outcomes. Everything begins to feel connected to you in a way that is difficult to explain, but impossible to ignore. Because what you are being is constantly being reflected. Not occasionally, not symbolically, continuously. And at first, this can feel unsettling because it removes the last place you could hide. You can no longer blame timing, luck, or circumstance. You begin to see that even what you once called coincidence follows a pattern that mirrors your assumptions, your expectations, your inner conversations. And once you see that pattern clearly, something shifts again. You stop trying to fix the world. You start observing yourself, because it becomes obvious that the world is not the problem. The state is. And the state is not something imposed on you. It is something you are occupying. Sometimes consciously, often unconsciously, but always consistently. So now the question becomes even simpler, but more confronting. What are you being when no one is watching? Not what you say, not what you try to think, but what you naturally return to, because that is your true state. And that state is what is shaping everything you experience. If you naturally expect delay, you will experience delay. If you naturally expect things to go wrong, they will. If you naturally feel overlooked, you will continue to be. Not because the world is against you, but because the world is aligned with you. And this is where the idea of the world is you pushed out becomes real. Not as a phrase, but as an observation. Because you begin to see that what appears outside of you is not separate. It is the echo, the reflection, the extension of what you are being within. So if you want to understand your reality, do not analyze the events. Analyze your state. Because the events are already finished. They're the result. The state is the cause. And the cause is always now. So again, gently, are you trying to change what has already been created or what is creating it? Because one keeps you reacting. The other returns you to power. And this is where everything becomes quieter. Less effort, less struggle, less urgency. Because you are no longer trying to manipulate outcomes. You are simply selecting identity. And identity, once stabilized, produces outcomes naturally. Without force, without pressure, without the need to control how it happens. Now understand something deep now. You are not just choosing a state once. You are either reinforcing it or replacing it every moment. Through what you feel, what you accept, what you agree with internally. And this is why awareness must remain active. Not tense, not exhausting, but present. Because the moment you fall back into automatic reaction, you return to the old state. And the old state will continue to express itself until you stop occupying it. Not because it is stronger than you, but because you are still being it. So the shift is not about fighting old patterns. It is about no longer identifying with them. Let them appear, let them pass, but do not become them. because becoming is what gives them life. And the moment you stop becoming them, they lose continuity. They fade, and something else begins to take their place. Something quieter, more stable, more certain. Not emotional intensity, not excitement, but knowing. The kind of knowing that does not need validation. The kind of certainty that does not depend on what is seen. And that knowing is what reality reflects most clearly. Because the mirror does not respond to momentary feelings. It responds to sustained identity. So if your identity is still shifting, one moment confident, the next doubtful, your reality will appear unstable. Not because it is resisting you, but because you are not consistent. But the moment you stabilize, everything else follows. Not instantly in form, but inevitably in direction. And direction is what determines outcome. So now, one final question in this movement. Are you still becoming, or have you started being? Because becoming implies distance. Being removes it. And when there is no distance, there is nothing left to chase. Only something to remain. And in that remaining, everything you once pursued begins to appear. Not as something gained, but as something revealed. Because it was never separate from you. It was waiting for you to recognize that you are it. There is a final recognition, and it does not arrive as something new. It arrives as something that was always there, waiting for you to stop overlooking it. Not hidden, not distant, not complicated, just consistently ignored because you were taught to search elsewhere. Because from the beginning, the habit has always been the same. Look outward, interpret appearances, react, adjust, hope something changes. And within that loop, you never question the one who is perceiving. You never question the state from which everything is being experienced. You only question what is happening. But now that pattern has been interrupted. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough for you to see it. Enough for you to recognize that the entire structure of your life is not built from events, but from identity. And identity is not something fixed. It is something assumed, sustained, and repeated until it feels natural. So the shift is no longer about doing anything differently. It is about no longer forgetting what you are. Because forgetting is the only thing that ever created distance. Not real distance, but perceived distance. The illusion that you are here and what you want is somewhere else. But there is no somewhere else. There is only state, and state is always now. So when you say, I will become, you are placing it in a future that does not exist. And in doing so, you remain in the state of not being. But when you say, I am, and you feel it as natural, as obvious, as unquestioned, you collapse that distance instantly. Not physically, but internally. And that internal collapse is what reality reflects. Because reality does not move toward you. It unfolds from you. And once you see that clearly, something simplifies. You stop asking when. You stop asking how. You stop asking why it has not happened yet. Because those questions only exist when you still believe it is separate from you. But when it is not separate, there is nothing to wait for. Only something to remain as, and this is where effort dissolves completely. Not because you have mastered something, but because there is nothing left to force. You are no longer trying to create a result. You are simply being the state that produces it. And that being requires no strain. It requires no repetition. It requires no validation. It is quiet, stable, certain. And from that certainty, something inevitable unfolds. Not because you made it happen, but because you stopped interrupting it. Because the only thing that ever interrupted the process was your movement back into old identity. Your return to doubt, to checking, to reacting to appearances as if they were final. But now, even when appearances contradict what you have assumed, you no longer give them authority. Not by denying them, but by not identifying with them. You see them, but you do not become them. And without becoming, they lose continuity, because continuity belongs to identity. And identity is chosen again and again, quietly, without announcement, until it stabilizes. And once it stabilizes, reality reflects it with precision. Not partially, not symbolically, but exactly. Because reality does not interpret you, it mirrors you. So now everything returns to one simple, unavoidable question. What am I right now? Not what do I want, not what do I hope, but what am I being? Because whatever that answer is already expressing itself, already shaping your experiences, your interactions, your outcomes. Not later, not eventually, but now. And if you listen closely, beneath all the effort, beneath all the techniques, beneath all the attempts to do it right, there has always been a quiet knowing. Not loud, not forceful, but consistent. A knowing that says, you are not waiting for reality to change. Reality is waiting for you to stop searching, waiting for you to stop becoming, waiting for you to simply be. And the moment you truly are, without contradiction, without returning, without questioning, everything you once pursued appears. Not as something gained, but as something revealed. Because it was never separate from you. It was always you.